March 12th, 2020 is going to go down in infamy for the sports world. Today is March 12th, 2021. It is the 1 year anniversary of essentially the entire sports world coming to a pause. The COVID 19 virus has affected all of the four major team sports leagues in different ways, similar ways, and I just kind of want to take a moment to reflect on everything. I remember whenever the leagues first announced the pause, all of them almost simultaneously going on pause, not knowing what to do. All of a sudden, at least for me, COVID 19 became very, very real. It all started when the NBA decided to go on pause on March 11th, 2020. You see, just a couple of days earlier, Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz was giving a press conference, and he really didn't wasn't concerned whenever it came to the COVID-19 virus. In fact, he was so not concerned that he actually put his hands all over the microphones as he was leaving. Just 2 days later, both he and his teammate Donovan Mitchell would test positive for the COVID virus. The NBA released a statement that same night after the positive test that the NBA season will be put on pause until they can come up with a way to return to play in a safe and healthy manner. The NHL, they were also in the midst of their season. They were both the NBA and NHL were coming towards the end of the regular season and looking to hopefully crown a champion come the summertime. The NHL did not immediately suspend operations. They waited till the following day, March 12th, 2020, to suspend all the operations. So now that's two sports leagues that have basically been put on pause. But there was a third league that was looking to start their season to hopefully play their games. They were in their spring training. The MLB had just started. I had a friend go to one of the spring training games. And unfortunately, on March 12th, 2020, the MLB also suspended operations. They said, we're going to cancel the remainder of spring training and hopefully come regular season, we can start on time. Unfortunately, that did not happen. There were a lot of disputes whenever it came to coming back to playing, both financially, length of the season, that the owners and players just could not agree upon. And so it created quite the big rift. The NFL, they sort of lucked out. The NFL had just wrapped up their season, and the Kansas City Chiefs were being crowned Super Bowl champions for the first time in 50 years as they brought down the San Francisco 49ers in Super Bowl 54. Some are saying that this is probably a good thing because at the time, the San Francisco Bay Area was a little bit of a hot spot whenever it comes to the COVID 19. Many speculate that had the 49ers actually won the Super Bowl and had the parade, having so many people in close contact could have created a very large outbreak in the city of San Francisco. That would not have been very good. So the NFL, they were somewhat benefited by the sports world going on pause they had just wrapped up. They did, however, close all of their offices on March 13th. So the day after the NHL closes and the MLB closes, they close their offices. And on March 26th, the NFL also closes all of their facilities. Let's talk about the MLB for just a little bit longer. The MLB, they struggle to come back. The MLB, they they wanted to start their season really, really bad. And they have the longest season of the four sports, 162 games. The players obviously wanted to play a longer season, and the owners, they knew that they weren't going to be able to play all 162 games. So they were trying to convince their players to play for less money, but the players didn't want to do that. Some of them were still looking to make what they would in a regular season, even though they're playing less games. It created a very big rift. Ultimately, though, the season returned on July 23rd, and the players and owners, they had come to an agreement. It was more like a, if we don't come by this time, then you guys aren't getting any money. Uh, they came to an agreement to play 60 games. The opening day game, I made a video calling it the worst opening day of MLB history. Now, I did not call it the worst opening day of MLB history because the play was bad. I called it the worst opening day because of the events that happened. Juan Soto of the Washington Nationals, the team that had just won the World Series, tested positive for COVID just a couple of hours before the first pitch. So one of your big all-stars, Anthony Rendon, is gone. Juan Soto is one of your big names, test positive and can't play. Now you're concerned about, is anybody else on the team positive? Who was in close contact? They'll have to worry about that in a little bit. But the game went on as scheduled. It was the Washington Nationals versus the New York Yankees. The game was called after 6 innings because of a thunderstorm. That's right. There was a storm that happened opening day, and it really felt like a red herring for what could happen during the regular season. Why are you guys playing the season during a pandemic? Not only that, but you're not in a bubble. You're still playing in your home stadiums and having to travel everywhere. What was really funny though is whenever they showed Rob Manfred on the screen was whenever everything started to just come in for the worst. That's when the storm really happened. And it's just funny because Rob Manfred, he was the most despised person in sports at that time because of how he handled the Houston Astros cheating scandal. And so just to see him do that, just to be on the screen, and then the storm clouds come in, hilarious. Uh, but there was just so much that went wrong with the season. The Miami Marlins, within the first week, had, I think, 17 or 19 COVID outbreaks. And so they had to postpone a lot of their games. The St. Louis Cardinals also tested positive a little bit afterwards. There was real doubt as to if the season can even continue because of how many games are being postponed, how many games are being uh, rescheduled. It was not a good time. And yes, I did just skip the entire window of no sports, but that was because in that time frame, we really didn't know what was going on. I remember I was just checking my phone all the time, hoping for any sort of news that sports might be coming back. But the MLB, they kept pushing through. I said that they need to go on a hiatus, 2-week hiatus. Just let all the teams heal up and then continue from there. They did not listen to me, and I don't understand why. I have 55 subscribers. I'm a pretty big name in the YouTube's community. They did not listen to me, and they continue to go through. The Toronto Blue Jays, they didn't even play in their home stadium because of the Canadian border. The Canadians border, they didn't want the travel going back and forth, and so they had to find a new location to call home. Ultimately, it came from Buffalo, New York. It it really didn't look like things were going to be going in a good way. But like I said, the MLB kept pushing through. They kept going. They completed the 60 games and they actually were able to get to a playoff format. So this was the playoffs. They expanded the playoffs because it was a shortened season. So instead of 5 teams making the playoffs from each conference, they allowed 8 from each conference. I really enjoyed this because more opportunities for all of the teams. They also did it in bubbles. So the AL teams, they did everything in San Diego. Well, San Diego, LA, they were in a bubble. And then for the NL teams, they did everything in Arlington and Houston and Texas. And then the actual World Championship took place in Arlington. This was big news. The MLB actually were able to get through a 60 game season, letting in a whole bunch of teams. And look at this, the Miami Marlins, who had not made the postseason since their championship win in, I think, 2003, they made it. These were the guys who had almost their entire team contract positive cases of COVID. And then the St. Louis Cardinals, they also had a breakout. They made it to the playoffs. It was a huge, huge deal. The NBA, they were able to come back on July 30th, but they decided not to go straight into the playoffs. The NBA decided we're going to bring in 22 teams who we think have a realistic possibility of making it to the playoffs. Like I said earlier, they were nearing the end of it. It was still somewhat of a close race to the finish to see who would make it. For the NBA, though, uh, after they played X amount of games, the top 8 in each conference would go to the playoffs like normal. And let's just talk about the stadium just really quick of the NBA finals. This was where everything was being held. The playoffs, the return to play, the 22 teams, they all went to Disney World and they played on a couple of courts. This was the design of it. These seats right here, they would have virtual fans. They would have messages all across everything. There was a social justice movement, and so the players were allowed to have social justice sayings on the back of their jerseys if they so desired. This is where the NBA finals were held. This is where the NBA finals championship was presented. It was huge that the NBA was coming back. And I remember watching some of the games because sports is sports. I'm so happy that sports are back. The other league that came back on August 1st was the NHL. The NHL came back. And while they didn't sort of did what the NBA did, where the NBA said, hey, we're going to have 22 teams play a couple more games to determine who makes it to the playoffs. The NHL had two bubbles, one in Edmonton and one in Toronto. They decided to do a play in round to determine who makes it to the playoffs. However, me and many other fans saw the play in round as just an extension of the playoffs. You basically brought in 24 teams, uh, four from the each conference. The top four were all guaranteed spots in the actual Stanley Cup playoffs. Then after that, you had all the other teams uh, competing for the final spots, and it would be a best of five series. Anything could happen. You saw teams that hadn't been there in a while actually make it to the playoffs. For instance, the Vancouver Canucks made it to the playoffs officially. The Arizona Coyotes made it to the playoffs officially. The Chicago Blackhawks made it to the playoffs. It was insane that all of this had happened. And it was really good. It was really good. The stadiums look great. It was fantastic. The NFL, though, they well, they had to make a couple of decisions. The NFL, they they had to cancel the draft. It was going to be held in late April, and they decided that we can't hold the draft in person. It'll be in Vegas. We just can't do that. So they had the draft virtually and televised it. It made it for a very weird experience, but one that is very memorable, to say the least. They also had to do other things throughout the season. The NFL was hoping that they didn't have to postpone the season or delay the start of the season, but they did have to cut the preseason. Those 4 games gone. So now everybody has a flat starting place to go from, and it was a little weird at first. A lot of these teams didn't even have training camps. A lot of these games, some of the teams weren't allowed to have any fans in the stadium, whereas other teams like the Cleveland Browns actually were able to have some fans in their stadium. Um, Throughout the season, we saw COVID outbreaks. The players are getting tested weekly. And if a player tests positive, they go and look at who was around them and if they were in any significant proximity, uh, in which case they can't play either. We saw this whenever the Denver Broncos were about to play the New Orleans Saints, and the night before the game, one of the Denver Broncos QBs tested positive, and all of their QBs were in close contact with them, and so they weren't eligible to play. They had a practice squad wide receiver play the quarterback against the New Orleans Saints. Obviously, the NFL didn't really like that, but they did what they had to. Uh, for like the Tennessee Titans, they had an outbreak in their organization where they weren't able to play for 2 weeks. The Pittsburgh Steelers had to move their games around because of just the Tennessee Titans. There were fear that they were actually going to have a week 17 because so many teams were having outbreaks. Uh, but the NFL also kept pushing towards the finish. And honestly, it was just a season I'm not going to forget. So think about this. We actually crowned a champion in all of the sports leagues. So the first champion was the Tampa Bay Lightning. The Tampa Bay Lightning defeated the Dallas Stars in the playoffs in Edmonton to win their first championship since the 03-04 season. Then, the next team to win their championship was the LA Lakers, who defeated the Miami Heat. This was their first championship since 2010. This is the first year since Kobe passed away. And the LA Lakers rode that emotion to the championship. They won it for Kobe. Then the MLB crowned their winner, the Los Angeles Dodgers. The Los Angeles Dodgers won their first championship since 1988, and they defeated the Tampa Bay Rays. And finally, the most normal part of the whole COVID experience was that Tom Brady won another Super Bowl. Yep, yep. We wanted everything to go back to normal. This is not what we meant. At least not what I meant. But so the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defeated the defending champion, the Kansas City Chiefs, uh, and won their first Super Bowl since the 2002-2003 season. This season has been one like unother, but as we saw, all of the sports leagues were determined to make it to the finish. And personally, I didn't know if they would actually be able to do that. Whenever the league started to shut down, I didn't know if we would have sports at all. I heard reports that we wouldn't have sports for 3 years, but they came back so fast within 4 months, or a little over 4 months, not within 4 months. We actually had sports back. And oh, it came back in a hurry because we had baseball, basketball, hockey, football all going at the same exact time. It was like whatever sport you are into, you can go ahead and find a game almost immediately. It was fantastic. And looking at how everything is right now, how the NHL has responded by having to create multiple divisions. They shortened their season just so they can play this year. The NBA, they shortened their season as well, but they're back in their home stadiums except for the Toronto Raptors. The MLB is looking to start their season on time. In fact, they're already in spring training. They're planning to do a full 162 game season. And of course, the NFL just wrapped it up, but they seem to be on pace to do the virtual draft again. Maybe not to the same extent as last time, but they're still looking to do that. Now, I did talk to some of my friends about what they expected from everything shutting down and where they think or how they feel that the sports world came back or responded to the pandemic. So I had a couple of Instagram stories, and the overall consensus about, were you surprised that sports came back so fast? 70 or 66%, so a third or two-thirds said no, they're not surprised that it came back that fast. Only a third were surprised it came back that fast. And then, so I also reached out to my friends. Uh, Chris, the Dolphins fan, he said, "For me, the year without any sports just felt weird. For someone like me that is very into hearing about all different sports, it felt just like something was missing and too quiet in a way." I think back to that time of not knowing what was going to happen, having to, well, focus in school, but I shouldn't say it like it's a bad thing, but just if it wasn't sports, I wasn't really watching TV. And then another one of my friends, Brandon, he came into an episode whenever I was making NHL playoff predictions. He says, "At the beginning of the pandemic, I feel like taking a moment to figure out what needs to happen next was very much needed. I also love that they had the show must go on mentality. Sports is something that people connect to and rely on as an escape. So deciding to continue sports, but with either a limited or non-existent crowd was very good on their part. Their decisions have not affected the way I watch besides the fact I can't go to games, but sitting at home will do for now. And I don't have to pay $12 for a beer." And yeah, the it's been a little nice not having to pay such big expenses and still being able to enjoy the games. My buddy Connor, from the first ever video that I made in July whenever I start wanted to talk about sports, his response to it was, "At the start of lockdown, I felt that it would not be possible for teams to play slash finish their seasons. I was very happy with how the different sports responded. They not only played games, they gave us champions. It was a little odd only playing shortened seasons or some teams missing games, but I was very pleased with the end result, and I'm glad the sports could give some life to this pandemic." And it really has. The sports world has responded in a way that I surely wasn't expecting them to. I think that they went above and beyond with how they responded to the pandemic. My buddy Tanner, who's been in a couple of my hockey videos lately, his response is, "Honestly, I had no idea what sports were going to look like. Leagues were canceling their seasons, and I wasn't sure we were even going to finish the games. I'm glad they got together and figured it out. Those NHL playoffs were one of my favorite things to hang out and watch during the quarantine." And I couldn't agree more because they felt more personal inside of that arena where they weren't doing the crowd noise. It was like, this is intense. The sports world has responded in a huge way to the pandemic. And much like the real world, we've all sort of evolved. The vaccine has come out, and it feels like we're almost done with this pandemic. And soon, hopefully soon, the sports world can get back on track and do what they're supposed to. I honestly look forward to not having to do a follow up to this video next year. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the final score. Thank you and good night.